Alright, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Evans Garage. Today I'm here working on my wife's 2003 BMW X5. It's an E53 and it has the M54 3-liter engine. The head gasket has failed on this M54 engine and I'm going to be replacing it. So I just returned from work. I was away for 5 months. Just before I left for work, the luck that I had was this car, the transmission cooler popped off, lost all of its coolant, and the car overheated. I didn't see any coolant in the engine oil, but it was just running rough and it only got worse from there. So the car still runs now, but you can't really drive it that far. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna pull the engine apart, I'm gonna pull the cylinder head off, I'm gonna take the cylinder head to a machine shop and have them check it, machine it if required, and get them to change out the valve stem seals as well while we're in there, and then I'll bring it back. I've got all new gasket kit. I'm going to throw in a new head gasket. Hopefully the head bolts are not going to pull out of the aluminum block, because that's a pretty common issue in these cars. If the car overheats, that the threads in the block will get pulled out during the overheat situation. We'll get right into it. I'll take you along every step of the way in replacing the head gasket in this car. Let's do it.
I'm here when you need my voice. I'm here when you need my voice. I'm here when you need my voice. I'm here when you need my voice.
Alright, so I've got the Vanos unit off now, and what I need to do at this point is I'm going to put the engine at top dead center. In order to do that, what I've done is I've taken a long screwdriver, all the spark plugs are out, taken a long screwdriver, stuck it in number 1 cylinder. There's, if you look way down in here, see that little blue thing by my fingertip? There's a little plug there. I'm going to take a pick tool, pull that plug out, and then in the timing kit, this steel pin will insert where that plug is. So as you rotate near top dead center, you'll try and push in on that pin and it'll lock in place. So I'm going to take just a ratchet and a 7/8 socket on the crank bolt, just right there, and just ratchet on it until I'm in the right spot. You want to make sure you're on the compression stroke here. In order to know that you're on the compression stroke, these 2 cam lobes are going to be not pointing down, so they're not pushing on either the intake or the exhaust valve. They're going to be pointing kind of towards the sky here. There we go. That's completely locked. So you could probably hear that pop into place when I was rotating the engine back and forth. Now the engine's at top dead center. Next I'm going to remove these 6 nuts on the timing wheels here. It's important that when you take these off, you note the position of them, because you want to put them back on the same way. So you've got this plate that has this kind of timing piece on it. Next thing behind it is another little plate. Again, keep the orientation correct. Next, I'm going to take this this little pin here that comes with the timing kit as well. I'm going to push down on this, and there's a hole in the back that'll hold off the tension that this provides, so that way I can take off the whole assembly easily. Don't forget the plate on this side. Okay, just a couple more things I've taken off in the meantime. The intake cam sensor here, and then there's also this upper coolant line, which is a good idea to replace. I already replaced this, so this is pretty new, but a lot of the times it'll break as you take it out, so you might want to replace the upper and lower coolant tubes while you're in there. The other thing just at the back there, you see that kind of bracket. From what I can feel, there's two 10mm bolts. I have to kind of work my fingers back there to remove. May not be the same for other cars, but on this E53, I think there's two bolts back there that kind of hold a couple different harnesses. So that's on the cylinder head. I want to take it away from the cylinder head so that way it's not preventing me from removing it. The next thing I'm going to do is take this off. Not really sure what that is. Smog something probably. So looks like there's two nuts there for that, to remove that. Okay, so I got the right tools here now. These are external Torx sockets. So these three E8s I'm going to take off next. And then I'll be able to pull those two gears and chain off as one assembly, keeping them together. Okay, I'm going to attempt to pull this off as one assembly. I'm going to attempt to keep these together. And I'm going to zip tie the chain to the gears here so that way nothing gets messed up. Looks like I missed a plate on this side too. That's kind of loose. Okay, a couple more pieces to take out here. Those just slide off. They can only go one way. Take this one out too. And there's this washer plate as well. Alright, next I'm going to pull this tensioner off. Looks like there's three 10mm bolts. Looks like I missed the fourth one back here. Alright, next I'm going to pull the tensioner off this chain, which is located from the outside of the cylinder head. There's this 32mm that you can get your socket on. See that? It's kind of spring loaded. Alright, next I'm going to pull these three 12mm sockets off using a deep socket. Alright, next I'm going to pull this sprocket out now that this chain is loose. I've got to pull this guide out before I can do that. Alright, so using E8 socket, I'm going to take this guide out. There's one there and then one back here. You might need to reorient the cam to access this guy back here. So that socket I had was a bit too big, so I'm resorting to using a 1/4 inch deep socket on a 1/4 inch drive ratchet. See if I can break it loose without ruining it. There we go. A long bolt on that one. Now I can pull out that sprocket now that the guide is out of the way. Okay, there's two more E8 bolts, one right down in there and down there that we'll need to pull out before we pull the rest of the head bolts out. Alright, the last thing I did here was I just moved that chain out of the way, kind of shoved it down there. This guide here will move when we pull the cylinder head up, and we should be able to just kind of pull it up and over that without it interfering. So at this point, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to tackle the exhaust manifold and see if I can tackle the exhaust manifold bolts while the cylinder head is still tight. If I can't do it that way, what I'm going to do is loosen all the cylinder head bolts so that way the head is loose, and then if I need to kind of pull the head up and access the exhaust manifold bolts a little bit easier, I'll do it that way. But I want to attempt it at least while the head is still mounted, so that way there's a bit more of a fixed point when I'm kind of wrenching on those exhaust bolts. All right, so I just went through the painful process of removing all of the exhaust manifold bolts. There's 16 nuts that are on studs. I had 14 of them come out with the studs and 2 of them come out without the studs. All right, so I ended up undoing the 4 bolts at the bottoms of the exhaust manifolds, just down by the exhaust underneath the car. These are loose now, each manifold. There's 2 manifolds, a front one and a back one. And I just took off these heat shields that were in there. So now that this is completely free from the cylinder head, at this point, I can take the cylinder head bolts out and then lift up the cylinder head. All right, so I've decided that what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna pull the camshafts off before I pull the head off. So in order to do this safely, from what I've read and seen online, is you wanna make sure that you're not bending the camshafts in any way or putting any unnecessary pressure in certain spots. So you can see the cam lobes are down here and down there. So I'm gonna leave that cap and that cap on take all the other caps off, and then quarter turn on each nut, slowly back it off so that way there's no uneven pressure on the cam. Okay, at this point I've got the camshafts out and both of these lifter trays are loose. When I try to pull these lifters out, all the lifters are most likely going to fall down. If you're not replacing your lifters, you should try and keep them in the same position that they are in now. I think you can get magnets to kind of hold them into place where they are against the housing when you take them out. But I'm getting I have new lifters anyways that I'm going to replace these with, so I'm not too worried about placement. I'm just going to pull the tray out and kind of clean up my mess after. There's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 lifters per side. Okay, second lifter tray. Maybe these ones will stay in better. Nope. Alright, at this point I have everything cleared off of the head, so I have access to the head bolts now. These are E12 bolts. There are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 of these head bolts. What I'm going to do before I take the head off is I'm just going to break all the head bolts loose, and then I'm going to re-torque them using the factory torque spec, so that way I can check the threads of the block to make sure that none of the threads of the block are pulled out before I pull a cylinder head off. So I'm going to loosen all these and then I'll recheck the torque spec on them. It's 30 foot. You have to do it in three sequential methods. It's 30 foot-pounds on all the head bolts, and then 90 degrees from there on all the head bolts, and then 90 degrees from there. So when I loosen them, I'm going to loosen them from the outside to the inside, and then when I tighten, I'm going to tighten from the inside to the outside. All right, and here's the final 90-degree pass. That one's loose. That's all right. Well, that's bad news. Definitely not good. We're gonna have to time-sert the block. All right, I'm just gonna attempt to pull the cylinder head out by hand here. Again, I don't have an engine lift on me, so this being an aluminum cylinder head and everything's off of it, it shouldn't be too bad. Oh boy, there's a mess down there. Oh god. Whew. Okay, so just inspecting the head gasket after cleaning things up a bit, you can see the culprit right here in the middle between cylinders 3 and 4, kind of as suspected from the OBD scanner saying there's a misfire in cylinder 3 and 4. It's a bit rough right there, but if you actually look on the back side, I think this is a 3-layer gasket, but the first, you can see here, the first layer there and the second layer, it looks like, have completely burned right through, kind of allowing the compression to go in between each cylinders there, or allow there to be a leak, at least, in between those two cylinders. So we found our culprit. Unfortunately, the thread's pulled out of the block, so I'm gonna have to order some time-serts, and we're gonna attempt to drill out the threads while the block is still in the car. Okay, so I'm just on the cylinder head here. I've cleaned up just this across in the center, and I've got the straight edge on top of here. And the biggest I can get, I checked, this is a 10 thou. Doesn't go in. Kind of just barely goes in that one. Fits under in the middle. Almost goes in there. So I can get 10 thou in the middle. That's probably not good, but we'll see what the machine shop says. And we'll see how much they actually have to machine off. All right, so I checked the surface of the block with the straight edge as well. I cleaned up the surface of the block first using a green scuff pad. Biggest feeler gauge that I was able to get in there was just 1 thou in the middle. So I would say it's pretty good on the block side at least. The only issue with the block is the threads pulled out on a couple of those holes. All right, so it's been probably 2-3 weeks since I've touched this thing. Again, cleaned everything up with a Scotch-Brite, green Scotch-Brite. Cleaned up the tops of the pistons, WD-40, and the Scotch-Brite kind of just rubbed the top of the pistons, clean them off with paper towel. So those are all good to go on this side. Latest update for the cylinder head. Machine shop looked at it, and they ended up taking 11 thou off of the mating surface between the cylinder head and the block. He said it was on the higher end, but still usable. So this ended up coming to $458, and with that they cleaned and inspected, pressure tested, vacuum tested, resurfaced. They took 11 thou off, and they did the valve seals while they're in there. That added about $100. And so the total on that came to $458. I also got them, they didn't add charge in there, but I also got them to clean up the valve cover, as well as I got them to clean up the cam trays, and they didn't charge me for that. So got that done at Piston Ring Machine Shop in Winnipeg. If you guys are in Winnipeg or near Winnipeg, they did a pretty good service, so I was very happy with them. Other thing I've decided is I'm going to use a Time-Sert to fix the threads on the block. I ended up getting this used on eBay. This is why it took me so long to get back to this project. It's because this took about just over 2 weeks to get here. I think I paid roughly $400 Canadian, maybe $450 shipped for this kit. And I'm going to hang on to this. If you're in the Winnipeg area, access to this kit, I would consider renting this out. I'm probably going to throw it up on Facebook Marketplace for a rental, because when I was looking, I definitely would have been I considered renting from someone in town if they had the kit, but nobody had the kit that I could find online. So I'm going to Time-Sert the block. That's my next project today. So what I'm going to do, before I walked away from this project for a couple of weeks, I cleaned everything up and coated it in WD-40. I'm just going to wipe it down with paper towel, and I'm going to cover up the entire surface of the block with just painter's tape that'll stick and that'll cover up all the coolant jackets and everything, so that way there's no chips getting down in there. But I'm going to cover everything in tape, and then once everything's covered in tape, I'll poke out the holes, and I'll work on each hole, one hole at a time with the Time-Sert kit. I'll probably end up practicing a couple, and then I'll show you the full process on one of the holes, and then that'll give you a rough idea of what Time-Serting the block looks like. I've Time-Serted 4 holes at the front here. Now that I'm moving on to the 5th hole, I'll show you the full process from start to finish. So you take your plate that comes with the kit and 2 bolts, line up this big circle with the hole that you're going to repair. So I'm going to do this one at the top. I'll line it up over here, take 2 other bolts and thread them in through these other openings. Okay, before you tighten these 2 bolts down, take your bushing that comes with the kit and the alignment tool, align it up in the hole that you want to repair so it aligns it perfectly. Then tighten down these other 2 bolts. Snug that up. Pull your alignment tool out. Okay, at this point we're ready for drilling. I'm just going to use my Milwaukee drill. Couple things to note here: go at a slow speed. So number 1 on the drill, and I'm going to lubricate with WD-40 on the drill bit as we drill, and we'll take our time drilling. We'll drill in, and we'll repetitively take it out, blow the chips off the drill bit, take this out, blow the hole so the chips come out of the hole, relubricate our drill bit, and then continue doing that. There's 2 steps on the drill bit, this one, and then there's a second step up here. So again, just take your time until it works all the way to the collar, and the collar comes to the top of the bushing here. Okay, now that we have the hole drilled out, what you want to do is you want to inspect the hole with a light. Look down into the hole, make sure there's no chips left in there, and then at this point we can top the hole. Put the bushing back in, take our top. I've got a nice top holder from a gear wrench top and die set, and we're going to run this top down until the line on this top, I don't know if you can see it, there's a line on the top, meets the top of this bushing. So we just run it down, we'll back it out numerous times to clear out the chips with the air hose, and then we'll be done tapping it. Don't forget to lubricate your top. Before we put the Time-Sert in, we got to clean up the hole. I'm just taking brake cleaner. And the air hose. Now we take our insert tool, apply some of the oil, Time-Sert oil, onto the driver tool before we put the Time-Sert onto it. Now we take the Time-Sert, put it onto the driver tool. Doesn't need to go too far, it'll thread itself in. And then take some thread lock and put it on the bottom outside of the Time-Sert threads. Like this is fine. We take our collar, throw that back in, inspect our hole first, make sure there's no chips. Collar, and then thread it in until the line goes to the top of the bushing. So when you're installing the Time-Sert, you'll feel it tighten up. Then you gotta kind of drive through that tight part. It'll get hard to turn. And that's the Time-Sert installing into the block. And then it'll get a little bit looser as you get the line closer to the top of the bushing. There we go, it's loosening up. And that means it's fully installed. Now we can back it out. Okay, now we'll take the plate off, and that's it. We'll mark that one. Done. 9 to go. Alright, so I've just finished with all the Time-Serts, and what I've done now before I throw the head gasket and the head back on is I've cleaned up as best as I can to make sure there's no metal filings inside the pistons, inside the piston bores themselves. I've rotated it over, wiped all the cylinder walls, wiped the tops of the pistons, make sure there's nothing in there. And then after I did that, so that was all with brake cleaner, I did the same thing, rotated the engine over, but with engine oil on my fingers, coated the cylinder walls, tops of the pistons with light film of engine oil, and then I went back over the surface with a brake cleaner on some of these blue shop towels. So now the surface of the block is completely clean. So what I can do next is throw the head gasket on, and then I'll be able to lower down the cylinder head. I just put on those 2 dowels, not to forget. Okay, so before I throw the cylinder head on here, just a couple things to note. I've put the engine back at top dead center with the pin engaged there, so it's right at top dead center. I've put the head gasket on now. This is a 3-layer head gasket. It's just the standard head gasket that comes with all the gasket kits, so it's no thicker than normal, even though they took 11 thou off the bottom of the cylinder head. Machine shop told me it should be okay. There's one. When I had the cylinder head on there, it was kind of rocking at the back. I wanted to try and seat it in both of the dowels, and in the front dowel it seated okay, and in the back dowel it seemed to be rocking, so it wasn't fully seated. And what I ended up having to do was take the cylinder head off, and then I tried to play with it again and get it back on there, but it was doing the same thing. So what I did was I took a rubber mallet and I had to lightly tap on the top of the cylinder head to get it to actually seat down on the alignment dowel. So now that it's on there, it's not rocking anymore, and I can see on the side that the head gasket is in position, and the cylinder head has a minimal gap between the block and the cylinder head. So I'm gonna get all the head bolts in there. I'm gonna lightly oil them with engine oil, and then I'll follow the torque procedures, which in this case is gonna be 30 foot-pounds, followed by 90 degrees, followed by 90 degrees on all the head bolts. Here, I actually forgot the washers. So the new head bolts that I had here in this head bolt kit, they actually don't come with washers. So I'm gonna grab the washers off the old bolts and I'll throw them on here. Okay, before I torque down the head bolts, there's these 4 smaller bolts that go at the front and one with one of the chain guides. Once I finish torquing the head bolts, I'll come back and I'll torque these down to their proper torque spec. Okay, so I briefly just want to talk about head bolts and the torquing procedure. So these head bolts are what is known as either torque to yield or torque to angle. So they can't be reused, and you have to get new head bolts, because if they're torque to yield bolts, when you rotate them on their second and third pass, where it says 90 degrees here, those will actually bring the head bolts to yield, which means they stretch under the tightening procedure. So if you go to reuse those head bolts and re-stretch them again, there's a chance that they could snap or loosen up over time. So that's why you want new head bolts when it comes to torque to yield head bolts, or bolts in general. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to torque according to this instruction. I'm going to follow, going in this order, this bolt 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and follow that procedure. I'm going to torque everything down to 40 Newton meters on the first pass, and then from that point I'm at a good setting for all the bolts. I'll tighten everything 90 degrees from there using the same procedure by bolt, and then I'll do a third pass at 90 degrees on all the head bolts on another 90 degrees. So I picked up a angle torque wrench from Canadian Tire. It's a Maximum brand that tracks the angle. The nice thing about it is you can ratchet and torque at the same time, and it'll remember the angle. So it's a little easier to use than some other methods, although it is expensive. It's a couple $100 for the torque wrench. But we'll go through the 40 Newton meter first pass, and then we'll do the 90 degree passes from there. I'll show you a little trick about what I was reading. After you set everything down to 40 Newton meters, I'm gonna draw on top of each head bolt kind of a directional line, so that way in case I get lost at some point and I forget which head bolt I'm at, I know exactly after my 30 Newton meters that I need to go 90 and then another 90. So all my head bolts are going to be, once the lines are drawn on top of the head bolts, they should be facing, if I draw them all this way, they should be facing this way, and then after that whole pass they should be facing this way, just so I don't get mixed up or forget about a head bolt or do one twice, for example.
When you need my voice, I'm here. When you need my voice,
Alright, I did 40 Newton meters on the first pass on all the head bolts. Now I'm going to come in and mark all the tops of the head bolts. Make sure I don't mess them up or miss one. Just going to do a straight line across. Okay, they're all marked. Now I'm ready for the second pass at 90 degrees. This is going to be the true test to see if those time-serts hold up.
I'm here when you need my voice.
Okay, now I just want to show you after I've done my first pass. All the bolts held up to the first 90 degrees on the first pass, but I just want to show you how easy the marking is now. All my marks are kind of this way now, and you can easily double check and see all the head bolts. Make sure they're all correct and they have been torqued down 90 degrees on the first pass. So now I'll go ahead and do the second 90 degree pass, and that'll be the final pass. And I've got my fingers crossed because that time-sert repair, I don't know. Just wanted to show you, this is the torque wrench I'm using, maximum torque wrench I got from Canadian Tire. I'm going to go live on this pass with you in sort of a time lapse, and I'll show you how I do the last 90 degree pass and how it goes. Also, one thing to note on the torque wrench, it gives you a peak value either in Newton meters or I think I set it to foot pounds, so it'll show you what the max torque is even though you're working by angle. So the maximum torque on the first pass of 90 degrees, they seem to be around like 50 to 55 foot-pounds. So we'll see what this one gets to. Nice thing about this is you can ratchet it, so you have lots of room. There we go, that's 90 degrees. And that ended up being 67 foot-pounds. Okay, I went 91 degrees. 67 foot-pounds. So here we go. I'll show you. Reset it. Now we'll move on to the second one. Okay, 90 degrees, 67 foot-pounds. That one got to 55.7 foot-pounds. That one was much tighter, 73 foot-pounds. 65 foot-pounds on that one. That ended up being 66 foot-pounds. That was 70 foot-pounds. That was 67 foot-pounds. That was 74 foot-pounds. 70 foot-pounds on that one. 66 foot-pounds on that one. 68 foot-pounds. And the last one, 14. $63 foot-pounds. Whew! I think that deserves celebration. Okay, I'm gonna tighten these 4 bolts at the front of the engine. They're gonna get tightened to 89 inch-pounds. All right, I just plugged all the intake holes now, just to protect anything from falling in there. I also put the sensor back in. All right, I put the coolant pipe back on the side of the block and into the cylinder head. 1 nut there and 1 bolt back there. All right, so the next thing I did was I put the 2 10mm bolts onto that little bracket that goes on the back of the cylinder head. All right, next I put the intake cam position sensor back on. I just finished installing the exhaust manifolds onto the cylinder head. I still need to do the bottoms of the exhaust manifold to the rest of the exhaust, so I'll have to drop the exhaust and replace the gasket and the nuts that I took off of there, and I'll probably have to clean up the threads with a die down at the bottoms of the exhaust manifolds. But the hard part's done here. I've got the new gasket slash shields on behind each manifold, and I managed to get all the studs on and all the nuts on, no problem. There's actually quite a bit of room if you take your time to reach the back one from the bottom mostly, and then this front one mostly from the top side at the front. But now that I've done the exhaust manifolds, I put this piece on. The next step is going to be throwing in the cam trays with the lifters. All right, so just before I install the cam trays, I need to install the lifters into the cam trays because you can't install them from the top side. They need to be installed from the bottom side. In order to keep the lifters up while you install them, because they have a tendency to want to fall out when you install them, you can use magnets and put magnets onto the lifters because they're steel, and then just catch them on the lip of the aluminum edge of the lifter tray, and that'll hold up all the lifters when you install the entire tray. One thing to note when you install these trays, there's an E and an A on both the trays. The E goes on the intake side and the A goes on the exhaust side. Okay, just installing the intake side, so the E with all the lifters installed, the cam tray. Okay, so remember before you install the lifters, just to take some engine oil and lubricate all the lifters and all the bores of the lifter holes before you put the lifters in there. Okay, now the exhaust cam tray with the A is going in. Got to make sure it's seated fully on these detents that are under there. There's one here and then one at the back. Okay, the back you can tell is seated. There's a bit of a gap at the front. Might have to push. Oh, there we go. Okay, got the front seated. Rock back and forth a little bit. Yeah, that's fully seated. Okay, now we'll make sure to take all these magnets off. Okay, so I just installed the exhaust camshaft, and I'll put you on a time lapse when I install the intake camshaft, but a couple things to note during the camshaft installation. If your engine is at top dead center, that means piston number 1 and piston number 6 are at the top of their bores. So make sure that when you put on either the exhaust or the intake camshaft, the lobes are not pushing down on either number 1 or number 6 cylinder. Otherwise, you're going to tighten the camshaft down and the valves are going to push right into the pistons. Make sure that the camshaft labeled with an A at the back of the camshaft is installed on the exhaust side. Your caps are numbered A1 through, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to the back with the lettering shown just like this. So I'm going to install the intake camshaft now. And what I do when I was tightening down the camshaft is I just kind of evenly put pressure on the camshaft as I tighten it all down, and then I torque it down to spec, which in this case is about 132 inch-pounds using my inch-pound torque wrench. Okay, so I have both camshafts installed here now, and at this point I can begin to time the engine. So that timing kit that I bought, I'll link in the description box below. But essentially what we're going to do is take both camshafts, get them square at the back with the jig that comes with the kit. See where those 2 dots on the tops of each camshaft are? The jig will align it so they're perfectly straight up and down with those dots pointing up, and then we can proceed to assemble some of the sprockets at the front side where the vanos goes, and then there's another jig that comes on here with those cup things that go over the end of the camshafts, and they set the correct depth before you tighten a few things down. Alright, so the first step in timing this is to take this wheel, put it onto the chain. So I kind of had to slide it behind this guide. It might be a good idea to put this guide on after, but I still was able to put this wheel onto the chain, and then you want to kind of slide it up onto the front of the cam. It'll rotate back and forth a little bit, and you want to rotate it so there's tension. So there's tension on this side of the chain, and then take your eye and look on this side. On this side there's an arrow, and you want that arrow to be roughly the same level as the surface of the cylinder head here where the valve cover sits. So you can play around with it. Just make sure when there's tension on this side, so where your tensioner comes in from the bottom, it'll tighten it up kind of like that, and it should be roughly the same level as where the valve cover sits. And you can play back and forth and kind of just move the chain a little bit one way, move the chain a little bit the other way on this sprocket, and see where it aligns best. So I found the best spot here. All right, next I'm going to put the upper tensioner on for this chain that goes across between the two camshafts. These 4 bolts that go in for the upper tensioner are tightened down to 88 inch-pounds. All right, next I'm going to take this tool that came with the timing kit. It's a tensioner tool. Put it in where the tensioner would go. Just thread in the large part first, and then you thread in by hand the inner part of that tool until it puts some tension onto the chain. So right there, it's pretty much as far as I can get it finger tight. I'm not going to go any further than that. All right, so next I'm going to install this piece as well as this piece. Both of these cup pieces are the same on the intake and exhaust, but it's a good idea when you disassemble and reassemble to make sure everything goes back exactly where it was. So on this piece, you'll see a deep side and a shallow side. The deep side goes towards the front of the engine. These 2 pieces can only go on one way because the one slot is larger here, as well as on the outside of this cup aligns with it. And on the inside of this cup, there's also the same idea onto the front of the camshaft. So these can only get aligned one way. So I'll put these 2 together, and then I'll slide the cup onto the camshaft. There we go. Okay, next up we're going to throw these 3 bolts in with the shoulders towards the front of the engine. They get tightened down to 177 inch-pounds. So they go through the washer plate that we just installed. This piece is still able to rotate as required. I'm going to take these 2 sprockets, the chain, and this cup, and install them on the front of the camshafts. So this alignment tool comes with the timing kit, and you want to make sure that it's lined up according to the timing tool with this gear, and then there's these 2 pins to align this sprocket. So I'm just going to take this directly off now that this is kind of aligned the chain and the 2 sprockets to each other, and then I'm going to throw it on the front of the camshaft. Alright, next we're going to throw these 3 bolts just finger tight in here. Now we'll throw this washer plate on these shoulder bolts, and then this conical washer that has an F with the F to the outside as well over the shoulder bolts. And then finally this timing wheel over top of the shoulder bolts as well, with this lip facing towards the front of the motor. When you install this timing wheel, there's an arrow on this side. You want to make sure that arrow is at the same level of the cylinder head, the surface of the cylinder head right here as well. Throw these 3 nuts on. And on this side we'll install this washer plate that says front, with the front facing towards the front of the motor. And then throw the 3 nuts on. Okay, before we tighten things down, we need to have the correct positioning of these two cups to each other. So as you can see, I can move this one, and that back plate behind here will rotate until I'm in a different position. So there's a plate that comes with the timing kit, just this guy here, that goes on where the Vanos would bolt. Now what you want to do is you want to bring these cups out such that when you put the plate on the front, it still allows the plate to push in on the cups. So I'll make sure that one's out all the way as well. I'll take this tensioner retainer off. I'm now going to throw this plate on the front, make sure our gasket isn't on the cylinder head, because this puts the cups in the right timing position. We'll throw on a couple of nuts to suck it in. Now that this plate is on, we want to double check, peek inside of here, make sure these cups are flush to the inside of the plate, so that way there's no gap between the cup and the plate. And at this point, we can go around now and tighten down all of the nuts and bolts. Okay, first we're going to tighten these E8s down to 44 inch-pounds. And we're going to tighten down all 6 of the 10mm nuts to 44 inch-pounds as well. Final torque on the E8 bolts is 20 Nm or 177 inch-pounds. And the final torque on the remaining 6 nuts is 10 Nm or 88 inch-pounds. Alright, at this point what I'm going to do is I want to rotate the engine over, make sure that the cams stay in time, and I want to make sure that none of the valves hit the pistons as I rotate the engine over. One complete revolution. So I'm going to pull this timing block off the back of the camshaft, and then I'm going to pull that timing pin out. I'm going to rotate the engine over one complete revolution. If I feel any resistance, I'm going to stop and go back and check my work. Alright, so that was one complete revolution. I didn't feel any resistance as I was going through and rotating the crank. So now I'm going to put the timing pin back in and we'll proceed with the next step. Alright, and we got that plate back on the back and it fits. So we know everything is now in time. Okay, at this point I'm going to remove the timing kit tensioner and reinstall the actual tensioner. Alright, and for the tensioner, there's no specific torque spec that I'm doing, I'm just tightening it. Alright, now the last thing we can do is remove this front plate, the rear plate, and our timing pin for the last time, and then we can put the Vanos unit back on the front, valve cover on, and the rest of the intake parts.
Give it time. I know that I'm not easy. This cold heart of mine, she really took a beating before you. You stuck through blizzards, winter nights with you.
Okay, these reverse thread torques get tightened down to 71 inch-pounds. Okay, and these caps that go on the outside of the Vanos get tightened to 37 foot-pounds. Okay, so don't forget to put that blue timing pin cover back in the alignment hole at the bottom driver's side of the engine bay here.
Now I'm blooming just for you. For you. There's nothing I wouldn't do. For you. There's nothing I wouldn't do. For you. There's nothing I wouldn't do.
Alright, so I've got most of the engine bay buttoned back up here. I'm just waiting on a couple parts now because I don't want this to happen again. And what I'm going to be doing is installing a set of gauges. I want to monitor oil pressure and oil temperature. You can get a aftermarket cap for the oil filter that you can monitor the fluid with. I'm also going to be getting a aluminum thermostat, so I haven't put any coolant in the system yet, but you can tap the top of the aluminum thermostat for a coolant temperature sensor
I'm going to run those 3 sensors back to the gauge, and then I'm also going to see if I can monitor the coolant level with the coolant low coolant warning level sensor that's on the bottom of the expansion tank. Some of these E53 X5s did not come pre-wired for the coolant low coolant level sensor that shows on the dash. If you have a low cluster like this car does, it just wasn't wired. The wiring harness and gauges were not pre-wired for it. If you had a high cluster, they were, but the low cluster, they weren't. So I'm going to see if I can take those 4 sensors, wire it to a gauge, so that way next time if I do lose coolant, I'll know right away by the temperatures, and I'll get a warning on the gauge system that I'm going to put into this car. So just waiting on a couple things, and then doing a couple last minute things now, hooking up the exhaust to the bottoms of the exhaust manifold with the rest of the exhaust system, which has turned out to be a little bit of a pain in the butt. I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so I'm just down at the bottoms of the exhaust manifolds. As you can see here, I've got 2 of the studs out of this bottom of the manifold here. They all had studs in them, but when I removed the nuts originally to loosen up the manifolds, what had happened was these 2 nuts broke off with the studs in them. Those ones came off of the studs. So now I'm dealing with a situation where I went to put everything back together, but these studs weren't long enough because they broke off with the nuts on them. So I just went through the painful process of heating that up with a propane torch. Actually worked. I just put the propane torch on each stud for about 3-4 minutes, and then I took my 4-pound shop hammer and I just beat the crap out of the ends of those studs as hard as I could for a few minutes, and I had to do that a couple times on each stud before the studs finally gave way and punched through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some new grade 8 hardware, nuts and bolts, and just through bolt them. Even though it's a little more convenient to have, studs like that, so you only have to hold one side while you're wrenching it on. The next solution, instead of using the studs, is just to use a bolt and nut. And then what I'm going to do with these 2, since those are fine, I'm going to see if I can clean those up with a die, and then just get 2 nuts for that thread size that I use on the die. Alright, and here's what it looks like with the Race German thermostat housing, oil filter cap, and the power steering reservoir cap. And also this is the M56 valve cover. That's aluminum as well, so I'm slowly eliminating all the plastic parts on this. One of the next nice things to do would be get an all aluminum radiator, because these radiators have plastic end tanks, and they also do make an aluminum version of the expansion tank now. That would be nice to get as a nice upgrade, because these expansion tanks tend to crack and break over time. So we'll slowly upgrade this thing, and it'll turn out to be nice and bulletproof by the time we're done with it. Okay, so unrelated step, but I needed to install or replace the factory electric fan at the front. So I just did that. I had to remove the front bumper in order to replace that. So that's in there now. I've got it plugged in. That's another step checked off the list. Next, I'm going to change the engine oil, and then after that I'm going to top up the coolant, bleed the coolant system, and then pressure test the coolant system before I fire it up for the first time. Alright, so I've changed the engine oil, and I also changed the engine oil filter just here under this cap. I topped up the coolant, and I bled the system as best as I can before starting the engine. So what I did was I went in the cab, I turned the key to the run position without starting the motor. I turned the temperatures on the heater controls to max, and I turned the fan to max to make sure my coolant pump was on. I felt it and it was running. Opened up the cap and I topped it up, and it kept sucking it in until I got to the point where the float was at the correct level. So that's as far as I can go to bleed the system before running it. When I am running it, I am going to try, before it gets warm, to use the bleed screw and bleed off any extra bubbles, and then I'll come back and check it a few times. What I've done now is I've put a cap on the expansion tank This is a pressure tester for a coolant system. I've pumped it up to 14 psi here, and it's been sitting for a few minutes, and I checked for leaks. Nothing's leaking on the ground. That's all old oil residue from me just changing the engine oil, making a spill. But there's no leaks. She's still sitting at 14 psi. I'm gonna leave that for a few minutes, maybe an hour. Come back and check it. And if there's no leaks in the system, then I'm at the point where I've changed the fluids, checked the coolant system, and I'm ready to fire it up here. All right, so I pressurized the coolant system and left it overnight. It was at 14 when I left last night, and this morning you can see it's about 12.5 or 13, so it really only lost just over a psi. So I'd say that's a pretty good test overnight if it pretty much held the pressure all night. Okay, so I decided to pressure test the system to 21 psi. I've had it here for a few minutes now, and it's holding the pressure just fine. I'm not seeing any leaks anywhere. So at this point, I'm considering the cooling system sealed up and good. So I'll take this off, throw the cap back on, and we'll attempt to fire it up here pretty soon. Okay, so we're at the moment of truth. I'm gonna fire it up here in a minute. I've got the OBD scan tool hooked up right now. I'm going to monitor coolant temperature at the radiator outlet. That's the one on the lower coolant hose. I'm going to monitor oil temperature, the engine, as well as battery voltage. That's all that I can get off the OBD. So it's especially important, I want to keep an eye on the coolant temperature as we run this, because I don't want to overheat it. Make sure everything's running nice. I'll get it up to temperature, and then if everything works well, I'm also going to try out the AC, make sure the AC works, and I'll keep an eye, check for leaks, make sure everything's good, get it up to temperature, and then I'll shut it off, let it cool down, and once it's fully cooled down, I'll check the coolant level. Alright, here's the first startup after the head gasket replacement on this E53 X5 M54. Okay, so a couple things I've noticed. There seems to be quite a bit of smoke coming off from the exhaust manifold side. I suspect that's just from me touching it with my greasy hands, and that's all burning off once the engine's getting up to temperature. Kind of everything smoke-wise I'm not too concerned about, because there's a lot of just residues from all the work that I've been doing. The other thing I noticed was the top of the new cap. The sensor location on one of these 1/8 inch MPT ports seems to be leaking, so I'll have to address that after. That's minor. I tested the AC, the fan turned on, and it blew cold inside. I think we're almost up to temperature. Yeah, we're at 95 degrees Celsius, which is right about normal. Oil temperature seems to be okay, 71 degrees, battery voltage seems okay. These are all the readings I have for now, but everything seems normal. The only thing I was slightly concerned about at the beginning was the lifter tick. So I installed new lifters, and there was quite a bit of lifter tick at the beginning for the first, like, I don't know, 2-3 minutes of running the engine. And then just as it's been running and warming up, the noise actually has gone down significantly. There was also quite a bit of smoke coming out the tailpipe that was white. I'm assuming that's all residual from the exhaust that's just burning off, as well as some of the whatever was left over as I reassembled the head onto the engine block, kind of just leftover coolant, whatever, in the exhaust passageways or something. But it's all seemed to have burned off. Okay, so we're on a test drive now. We're out with the car. I've got the OBD gauge hooked up. We've been driving now for probably about 15-20 minutes. Engine's up to operating temperature. Our coolant temperature is 92 degrees Celsius. Our engine oil temperature is 103 degrees Celsius. Radiator outlet is 65. And everything seems to be going smoothly so far. The AC is nice and cold. The engine sounds good. I've revved it up a couple times, kind of like sport mode, off of a couple stoplights, and everything sounds pretty good. Maybe I'll give you a demo here. So we're not getting any weird noises at this point. I think everything sounds pretty good. I thought there was a little bit of a lifter tick noise, but it seems to have gone away for the most part. But I'll keep an eye on that. The only other thing that I was considering doing is maybe keeping this oil interval after the head gasket, keeping it a short interval for the first oil change, just to get rid of any of those extra contaminants that might have kind of fallen in from the head gasket job. So I might do it after like 500 or 1,000 kilometers, just to get some fresh oil and a new filter in there. The only other thing I wanted to say and do, which I'll probably make as a separate video, is I'm going to be installing a gauge system. Most likely at this point is going to be the Banks iDash, and I'm going to install for oil pressure, oil temperature, coolant temperature, and coolant level, and we're going to monitor it on one gauge and have it on a suction cup mount just on the windshield up here, so that way in the future, if we ever have a rapid coolant loss in the vehicle, we'll be able to tell right away and have built-in alerts into the gauge system that'll alert the driver, whether it be me or my wife driving the car, ahead of time, so that way we pull over right away instead of overheating the engine and running into a disaster and having to do this whole job again. So, thanks for watching, and stay tuned to the Ovens Garage for the next video. Cheers.